Scott Smith, thank you for joining me in the studio. So, welcome back, I guess I should say. I want to start with you talking about your background in environmental advocacy. You've been called into more than 70 different chemical disasters at this point. You've been doing this for years. How did you get started in this, and what brought you to this work?
First of all, thanks for having me, Pam. I appreciate the opportunity to sit down with you. And what started this all was in June of 2006. There was an unprecedented flood in upstate New York where I had a factory and 100 people, and we were literally wiped out in oil-contaminated floodwaters. And that's when I realized that there were still like chemicals in the water, and they were taking instantaneous grab samples from the surface. And water and contamination were never in equilibrium. I'm like, wow, all these standards are based on assuming everything's in equilibrium or a steady state, and it's not. So that kind of started the process, and then the insurance company didn't pay, and I liquidated my life and restarted everything. And at the time, Chuck Schumer was the senator, Hillary Clinton was the senator, and George Pataki, a Republican. Back in 19 years ago, when disasters happened, partisan politics were put aside, and everyone worked together. So. And then we started a long recovery.
So it was really your own experience where you kind of learned the science to say, this isn't completely making sense to me, for you to start testing and gathering samples yourself.
Correct. And then I became obsessed with oil and water, and I developed some technology for testing for remediation, and then came BP in 2010, where I really learned a lot more.
Yeah, so tell me about that, because the technology that you developed was actually used during that BP oil disaster to filter oil from water and from other contamination. How did you come up with that?
Well, I think they say the invention, the mother of all invention is necessity. Well, sitting in the corner, when the oil spill happened and, the oil contamination flood came into the factory and everything was spilling everywhere, the white sorbents or the white booms you see on all the news, nothing was working. And at the time I had a medical grade material that had a high surface area that was the only approved material for human contact because it didn't have plasticizers, and it was, it ended up being FDA approved, and that was absorbing all the oil out of the water and repelling the water. So, I stumbled onto that, and then I figured, the insurance company's not going to pay. I got to liquidate my life and save the job, save the company. I became obsessed with oil and water, and I started filing patents. And then I read about BP, and no one would return any of my phone calls. So I packed up a duffel bag with these already FDA-approved medical-grade foam, and I went down to BP, and I think it was an iPhone 2. Went by myself, chartered a boat. The captain said, thousands of people before you, and I threw him my iPhone. I just said, take me to the oil. And then I started literally wiping off the marshes, and it was repelling the water, and the captain's like, wow. So then I sent a video of that off to the command center, and the next day, no one had called me. I was on my way back to the New Orleans airport, and then BP called and said, are you Scott Smith? And I say, yeah. I said, well, can you turn around? And they were able to utilize that technology and prevent the needless burning of marshes, and it was deployed over 200 miles of coastline. But however, where the testing thing came up is, NOAA scientists and others, and when I was, deploying, the scientists started talking about water and contamination. If you just take the surface, it's, or just a grab sample, it's only going to tell us what's in that bottle of water. So you have an ability to test and not just remediate the whole water column. So I started learning this with these scientists, and then they said, well, Scott, you're onto something here. You should start filing patents. So I started filing patents, and 19 years later, I have about two more just issued, somewhere between 25 and 30 patents now to my name.
Wow. So, traditionally speaking, you graduated from Harvard Business School, not necessarily in a science field, but you kind of learned in the field from scientists.
Yeah, a Baylor undergrad, and I say Harvard Business School has come in handy because what Harvard taught me, and it's funny, at Harvard, I went to public school, and a lot of people at Harvard were legacies, and I used to stand up and say I went to public school, and people looked kind of me funny because all the legacies and everyone went to prep school. And Harvard is really good because it taught me that I can hold my own with anybody else. And it prepared me very well for dealing with sometimes government agencies and the EPA. Majority of people are great, but they can be a little condescending and arrogant. And it helped me with my ability to stand up to people.
Walk me through your process. And I understand it's different depending on the situation that you're flying into, but maybe just East Palestine and BioLab specifically. You get on site, you gather these samples up, but what are you doing? Where do the samples go? How do you get the results back? What's the whole step-by-step process everything goes through?
First of all, I find out about most of these contamination events, right as you see them or a little before on the news. And I don't go anywhere unless residents reach out and ask for help. So that happened in East Palestine, and that also happened in Conyers. So what happens is they call me. I try to get on the ground as soon as possible. Then I go and try to get close to ground zero. In the BioLab case, it was close to the retention pond, and getting close. And I try to look for the full spectrum of chemicals. And then from my prior work in all my patents, I use ALS laboratories or Eurofins, two of the top labs in the country. And I look for the full spectrum of chemicals. And one of the things that I have said over the years is you can't find what you don't look for. But Pam, it's that simple. I mean, if you're going to declare something, the problem is the responsible parties and the EPA they don't look for the full spectrum of chemicals, and they can say, you can't find what you don't. I say you can't find what you don't look for, then they declare everything safe.
Yeah. And once you get the results back, you interpret them. Do you ever send them out to a third party for another person to interpret, or you usually interpret your own results?
Oh, I don't interpret my own results. I have a whole team of scientists around me. And because I tend to be built differently than others, and I can withstand subpoenas in the driveway and the smear attacks and the defamation. So there's a whole team of anonymous whistleblowers. I'm also a Government Accountability Project whistleblower, and a whole team of scientists. I don't give a presentation without reviewing it with my team of experts.
Now, you mentioned Eurofins. I know from emails that we've obtained at GPB that GHD was a contractor working along with the EPA and BioLab testing the air. They had sent some samples to Eurofins Atlanta. Now, knowing that you use the same lab, what does that say to you that the samples are going to the same place?
Yeah, I mean, Eurofins is a qualified lab, but it's when you take the sample, how many days afterwards, and if you don't instruct the lab on the chain of custody what you want to find, for example, if you don't tell them to look for benzene, you're not going to find benzene.
Yeah. So I want to talk about East Palestine specifically now. So you conducted independent dioxin testing in East Palestine, and you found levels that you described as significantly elevated or extremely high compared to background samples. Can you explain just what that testing revealed about the contamination and how your findings compared to what the EPA was talking about?
Yeah, this can be complicated, but I'll be as simple as I can.
We'll try to break it down as you go.
I looked for semi-volatiles and a whole host of other chemicals, but as to dioxins, they're unique and they don't go away, and they build up in your body, and there's something called the body burden. And what you want to do is you want to get in I went to several places we call a control, where the toxic plume did not deposit, where we knew from the weather patterns. And we compared that. And also, the Norfolk Southern contractor that also worked with the EPA, for example, set a threshold of 4.8 on dioxin TEQ. Won't get into those details. Well, the point is we have and the TEQ is like an index.
So the TEQ is the toxic equivalency.
Yeah. So it doesn't capture everything. And for anybody that wants to see more detail, you go to the June 27th, 2023 email that I wrote to the EPA. That explains everything in detail. But back to just at a high level, basically over 50% of my samples were not in what I would call a hot zone or substantially elevated. So the notion that I'm somehow all the false accusations coming from the EPA just are completely erroneous. And I was able to identify what I would call a hot zone where the dioxin TEQ was significantly elevated over the threshold set by the Norfolk Southern contractor. So what we saw there were two events in East Palestine. There was the initial one, the smoldering burn, which didn't go out for at least 9 days, it appears to have created a lot of dioxin. Then there was the vinyl chloride. But then there's the third event, where Norfolk Southern, to get the train up and running, I've been told that 1 million to an hour. If that's what I've been told recently. So they basically saved the worst for last in their remediation. And what the scientific team I've been working with, and we've presented at the Society of Environmental Toxicology, we've presented at the Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry conferences twice, and we're going back for a third time this fall. So what we were able to lay out is where the dioxins were elevated, where we call were the hot zones where people were exposed.
And so the EPA has stated that you're extremely high value. They've acknowledged these high levels, but said that cannot be directly compared to EPA results. I mean, how do you respond to the EPA's critiques of your methodology? They're acknowledging the high levels, but saying that the interpretation is wrong.
Yeah, I would refer to, recently there have been a lot of whistleblowers that have come out from the EPA. There's a very senior level person who has chosen to remain anonymous at this point because he sees all the attacks on me. And he has gone through my data along with Stephen Petty, who was the class action expert who was silenced ultimately by the class action attorneys, has looked at my data. And, there's the data I've offered to sit down with the EPA. So the EPA is basically interpreting with what appears to be the false narrative coming from Norfolk Southern, nothing to see here, saying it's all in the background. You're going to hear this, Conyers, Georgia, and the symbol thing is they're going to ubiquitous in the environment. That's why you have to systematically gather all this data, and you have to go to air zones that weren't impacted for controls.
Yeah.
And also, to be clear, Pam, I offered to sit down with the EPA, and you've got it in writing from me, and they chose to ignore that. And you can see the pattern in the timeline, how they tried to undermine everything I was saying. And they refused to give me their detailed testing reports. And I said right in the email on June 27th, 2023, I'll sit down with you for the benefit of the community as long as we share the data and reciprocity. And Norfolk Southern and EPA backed out of the meeting because they only wanted to see my details, all the details, and they wouldn't share theirs. Well, now enough has come out. I know they didn't want to share their details because they were gaming it.
And so I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves, but yeah, so you were saying you were subpoenaed to turn over your testing results, but those results and the results that Stephen Petty had, you had residents who wanted those results included before the settlement decision was made in the Norfolk Southern case. What does that say to you that they backed out of the meeting, that your results nor Stephen Petty's results, he's testified in a number of different cases when it comes to environmental exposure, that those weren't factored in?
Yeah, that tells me that they know there's a problem with their narrative, nothing to see here, no long-term health effects. Because if there's nothing to hide, why not reveal? Why not get in the room for the benefit of the entire community and share all our details, not just summary results and reciprocity? And they refuse to do that. So when they don't want to release, and this is the class action attorneys, they don't want to release Stephen Petty's results, but the class action attorneys were all saying the same thing that I was saying, and that's recorded, on the news and the video. And then all of a sudden the settlement came out, and I don't know, they might have 200 million reasons or 180 million reasons why all of a sudden they switched their narrative. I don't know. But, again, the high level, there's great people from the EPA that are coming out of the woodwork and blowing the whistle. Very high level people that have more expertise than anyone involved from East Palestine.
Why do you think the EPA's approach in East Palestine was inadequate?
Well, I actually know from talking to this whistleblower who's, again, very high level, says there are two issues with the EPA. He calls, one is BDS, bureaucratic denial syndrome. That this is coming, they have a pretty good six-figure job, and it's going to make their job a lot harder if they really start talking about contamination. And then the other reason is there is what I call an incestuous network of contractors. We won't get into all those details, but where the EPA people will leave and then go to a very high-paying job at a contractor for one of the responsible parties like Norfolk Southern. And I'll give you one case in point. The subpoena in my driveway was signed by Duvino Pajara, former EPA attorney working for Norfolk Southern. And, people like to do a dive into my background and experience. I think turnabout's fair play. So if you look at her college, and they're all talking about environmental justice, sustainability, and to the point of what the other reason the anonymous whistleblower says is that they're basically about money. They sell out. They sell out.
And like you were saying, so records obtained, I think this was by a local station back in 2023, showed that there was an EPA official who raised concerns about dioxin testing delays in East Palestine. It seems like there are a lot of internal communications that you've provided and that others have found that align with what you're saying, suggesting that there was this internal dissent as well as what you were finding on the ground. Ultimately, what do you think the motivation is here?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question, Pam, because this is very relevant for Conyers, for Moss Landing, and in any chemical impacted community. That specific individual is Brian Gullett, or Goulet. I'm still not sure how to say his name. However, he's a dioxin expert within the EPA. And in his emails we've uncovered in FOIAs, he said, you don't want to go down 6 inches. You want to stay on the surface. So when the EPA was going down 6 inches, and he said, he was openly criticizing that for dioxins. And this goes to the point is with the EPA, they have, tens, hundreds of public information officers. If they would just allow their own dioxin expert to speak and address it, in test or meet with me, that's the best thing they could have done for the community. But he was silenced. He wasn't allowed to speak. Why isn't the media allowed to talk to Brian Gullett? You hear about, and also RFK Jr. reached out to me in East Palestine and requested, after he saw the documentary that Hank Bagwell did about my work there. And actually, with this latest information, RFK Jr. is 100% right. The EPA is captured and corrupt. And again, that doesn't mean, I want to be very clear, the EPA workers are all calling me anonymous whistleblowers. We've probably got 10 more coming out of the woodwork every week. I would say 70 to 80% of the people I'm hearing from in the EPA all want to do the right thing. They say, Scott, keep doing what you're doing. Don't let these attacks get you down. And then the people that rise up to the top probably have their sights set on going to work, for industry or law firms protecting industry. So that's why we are where we are.
So let's get into some of the surveillance that those documents you sent over show. You and the Government Accountability Project have discussed experiencing that harassment, smear campaigns. Can you talk about just the general nature of some of these incidents, including how movements on your social media were being tracked and monitored?
Yeah, it's one thing to kind of think this is going on, but the extent of it, it's not conspiracy theory, it's conspiracy fact. I mean, there's over 50 people tracking my movements on the ground with the EPA, and then the first time I went with my initial results on dioxins, I was on Fox News on March 17th, 2023. By March 20th, you'll see a Barbara McCree. We still don't know if she's a real person because she's an EPA address, works for the EPA. Some of these contractors disguise themselves. She puts in writing, can you tell me Scott Smith's address, where he lives and all that? And then the day later, Rachel Linduska from the EPA is writing that email with 50 people tracking my movements. Scott Smith walked into the auditorium. And another thing is all these people that were involved in surveilling me, tracking me, undermining me, they got an award for fiscal year 2023 last November for the collaborative efforts. So that's what we're dealing with.
And you mentioned being called a fake scientist. You've mentioned your findings being dismissed as misinformation. Has any of that impacted the community's trust in you and any of your personal relationships with residents in whether it be here or East Palestine or anywhere else you've been?
It gets difficult, but when people, when they see that I'm willing to sit down with anybody and talk and meet in person, I'm up for a challenge. And it hasn't been a problem building trust because I have nothing to hide and I lay it all out. And the other side, as they start their smear and defamation, they can never produce why I'm wrong. And let me, I've never referred to myself as a scientist, and it's acquiring knowledge in a systematic way. The media does, various people do. But I want to address that real quickly. When I address that, Thomas Edison is the most prolific inventor. He has over 2,500 patents. He doesn't even have a high school degree, and he's referred to as a scientist. Bill Gates didn't graduate from college. Steve Jobs, and a lot of times at public presentations, when I see this, arguments going on about this, and I say, look at your smartphone, look at the lights above you, look at your computers. So some of these inventions and everything, and then somebody like Stephen Petty that talked to me is like, look, and I work with a lot of academic institutions, and some down here, some scientists at Emory and Georgia Tech, they'll call me and say, Scott, we don't have any patents. You don't get a patent unless you go through a rigorous process, kind of like a PhD. So that's just, what do you call that? A red herring? That's just noise about this fake scientist thing. So, hey, if I'm in the company of Thomas Edison, I guess, who also would be characterized as a fake scientist, I'll take it.
Ultimately, who does this end up hurting? I mean, you're out there testing independently and getting results. You're offering to sit down with the EPA. You're offering to sit down with companies like BioLab. In the end, who gets hurt by all of this, all these hoops you're jumping through? It
really is. None of this stuff is about me. And again, I'm built differently. So like Tom Devine, the legal director that represents me at Government Accountability Project from Whistleblower, I wear it with a badge of honor. And I really want to say it's the focus of the chemically impacted community, because the real benefit, that's why whoever's smearing me, attacking me, I will still sit down with them and be professional and courteous for the benefit of the chemically impacted community. And that stands with EPA Region 4 and BioLab. I'm ready to sit down and talk at any time and talk about the details, because this is not just East Palestine or BioLab. It is a systemic failure. It's not Republicans. It's complete failure on all governmental levels, all parties, all agencies. And it goes to what I've learned from RFK Jr. He reached out to me, and I'll talk to anybody. I don't have to agree with your politics. And you'll see for example, I even made a video that day with RFK Jr. saying we can all agree on the future and the environment and our kids and the next generation. So that's who's going to lose in this process. People need to talk to each other. And this is not rocket science. These are all certified labs. Let's look for the full spectrum of chemicals, and let's get some answers to these people, because you don't really need my testing or anybody else's, whether it's Conyers, Georgia, Moss Landing, or East Palestine. None of these symptoms were ubiquitous. People were not reporting these health symptoms before these incidents.
And given your experience with EPA's communications in East Palestine and what you dealt with there, what does your involvement in all of these situations suggest about what may be seen in Conyers and may be happening down here now?
Well, what Conyers, and I'm going to present tomorrow at a town hall, and we have right now right around 37 different sites, and we're seeing a trend. And this is kind of like a murder scene or fingerprints. You've got blood splattered on a wall. So then in this particular case, you've got contamination that may have been splattered in soil and furnace filters. So I'm seeing trends that go all the way close to ground zero, out 30 miles out, with the same ratios and the same contaminants, and I'm going to talk about that. And it's actually quite simple if you lay out the science. In my role, I'm just one small part of a team. You may see me out on the front lines because, again, I can take the attacks, but the scientific team looks at everything, and there's some great experts involved that are going to get in way big time into the weeds and details when it starts talking about exposures.
Yeah. And I had a former BioLab employee reach out to me saying that, their fear is that this turns into every other environmental disaster that they've seen, that the attention quietly fades away and people forget, and you're just left with the remnants of whatever was in the plume. What is your hope in doing all of this testing and getting this information out to the residents? What is your hope ultimately?
It's actually keeping this out there so people can get the help, keeping it in the public, and actually bringing millions of people together from all these chemically impacted communities, because this can't go on any longer. If we all agree you care about your children, your grandchildren in the future, this cannot go on anymore. And here's the good news. There's so many great people. the coming out, I mean, yeah, there's a few bad actors here, but as we build awareness, I think we're going to change the way things are done permanently, and it's going to be fantastic for people's health and for the next generation.